Papers, Please is a video game developed by Lucas Pope in 2013. The game revolves around the daily job of a border inspector, one who must search through documents of travelers and immigrants and decide whether or not to allow them into the country. In this video essay, I will discuss how the design of the game works in favor of its intended purpose, to force the player into making difficult moral/ethical choices. The main mechanics of the game involve the inspection of documents, the highlighting of information to find discrepancies, and the stamping of passports to allow or disallow entry. The more people you process without any mistakes, the more money you make for that day. Any people processed after 6 p.m. that day, the player won't be paid for. At the end of each day, you have to decide how to distribute your money as to make sure your family is healthy, warm, and fed. Sometimes there are moments of bribery and crime that you can manipulate to make yourself more money. These situations give the player a less ethical form of income to help keep their family alive. These mechanics give the player difficult choices to make. Frequently, they have to choose between income for their family or for the well-being of the traveler/immigrant. These are the situations where it will be right before 6 p.m., and you just have to make a wild guess on the current traveler to make sure you get that extra bit of cash. As well, there are also times when you have to decide whether or not to allow evil people in, quote unquote, as they frequently technically have legible documents for entry. Sadly, there aren't many mechanics in the way of interpersonal connections between the player and the traveler/immigrants. All of this information is displayed just on paper and through small amounts of text displayed to the player, like speech bubbles. However, we will talk about that in the visual section later on. In Papers, Please, your main objective is to efficiently validate traveler information at a country's border in order to make an income to keep your family safe and fed. If you fail to raise enough money, your family will starve, die of sickness, or even freeze to death from lack of heating. If that happens, it is game over for the player. As well, it is also up to the player to raise money for the upgrades for their inspection booth. This gives the player more shortcuts and more efficient ways to process people. Finally, there are also many alternate story paths the player can take. There are a total of 20 different endings in the game. There is even a rebellious storyline, which leads the player to believe that the country they are working for is corrupt, further affecting their decisions by giving them a vague perception on what might be happening outside of the booth. These goals are present to give the player other reasons to worry about their choices. Having objectives that lead in many different directions further affect perception of the story to the player, which in turn makes proper ethical decision-making seem like a struggle. Whether you have to choose between sacrificing your own safety to join in a rebellion, to save someone despite them not being legible for entry just based on their words, or to save money for something that will, in return, leave a lesser budget for your family's necessities, this game provides so many different angles on which directions to take. Tasks, on the lesser grand scheme of things, are the building blocks that build the player up towards their goals. In Papers, Please, these involve the search or inspection of people through discrepancy highlighting, scanning travelers, detaining travelers, and generally making sure that people who are entering are of proper eligibility. On the story side of things, these tasks involve the investigation of criminal activity entering the country through manual searches, news correlation, and the handling of criminal documents from rebellious figures. You also need to keep your family healthy, as said already before, through the spending of your money on food, heating, rent, and medicine. These tasks allow for small interactions to build up that will further influence the decisions that the player has. In a way, it builds up the player's in-game persona. These tasks are a quote-unquote training ground to determine how the player acts throughout the game to reach their objectives. At its root, this is where most ethical/moral choices are made within the game, during these split-second decisions. The discovery and analysis of discrepancies through correlation of documents and instructions are the core challenge this game has to offer. It's a puzzle game. It can be very easy to miss a simple typo when looking over someone's documents. As well, there is the challenge of criminal discovery or investigation, which involves the player using the news outlets to help identify criminals looking for refuge. These simple challenges are a form of gamification added onto the overlaying theme of ethical and moral choices. It intrigues and works the player's minds while they have to make other decisions as well. As well, there is, of course, the challenge of moral and ethical decisions. This is the main focus of this paper, after all. These moments, however, are entirely up to player choice. The player has to make sure that they balance their ethical decision-making with their, quote, survival of the fittest form of thinking to make sure that their family survives, while still making themselves feel good when they help people get through or what they need. You know. The main rewards the player will go after when playing always involve money. Having a nice, healthy savings account will go a long way into the late game. The core mechanics of the game revolve around this as its reward. The faster you go without making mistakes, the more money you get in return. There are also rewarding moments in the game with no real monetary or quantifiable purpose. These moments involve the general feeling of accomplishment a person gets after completing a difficult challenge or puzzle. Every time I would discover a quote-unquote hard-to-find discrepancy, I felt accomplished in my abilities. As well, the discovery of the more, quote, rare or difficult endings the game has to offer, moments of, hey, look what I found, type of moments. The overall involvement of money as the core reward of the game is what cements together the family decisions to the individual traveler decisions when working. If you let someone go on the grounds of a sad story, the less money you will have for your family. Otherwise, you will be releasing those people back to their abusive countries or ban them from seeing their family on the premise of a typo or a simple error. The visuals in Papers, Please are very indie-like, with low-grade flat visuals that are easy on the eyes. While this is useful for examining quick facial similarities with travelers and reading information, it also dehumanizes the travelers and the people in my eyes. I tended to, at times, not really care for the travelers as much because they all visually looked strange or sometimes outright creepy. I didn't tend to care about them when making decisions because they just kind of looked like flat statue faces. I believe a more realistic or friendly art style with more realistic/changing facial expressions could have driven the game's intended purpose home. Maybe not as much friendlier, but just darker and more realistic looking. The audio in Papers, Please seemed to be extremely lacking. With no voice coming from the travelers or immigrant, it continued to dehumanize the facial encounters with these people even more, making them seem like straight-up rocks with text coming out of them. Some extra sound work could have really helped while still keeping the text bubbles for people who are playing on mute. Even the noise that your character makes when yelling for the next person on the line just kind of sounds like a disgruntled, weird Pokemon sound. I'm not quite understanding what that was supposed to be. In the end, Papers, Please is the game that made me really think about my decisions and test what I would do in the real world. It gave some insight into how sometimes you have to throw other people down to make sure that you, yourself, and your loved ones survive. I believed another theme of this game involves survival of the fittest, as you abuse your power for your own benefit to stay afloat. With some quick visual and audio ramping, I believe Papers, Please would be an even better candidate for a game revolving around ethical and moral choices.